Another episode of LGOtv Big Talk. And why Big Talk? Because I hate small talk. Now, my guest today is Liane Davey. And Liane Davey is the New York Times bestselling author of not one, not two, but 3 books, including this one, The Good Fight. Use productive conflict to get your team and your organization back on track. And also, You First. Inspire your team to grow up, get along, and get stuff done. She's a frequent contributor to the Harvard Business Review and is frequently called on by media outlets for her experience on leadership, on team effectiveness, and on productivity. She is the co-founder of 3 Co's, and she advises companies such as Amazon, TD Bank, Walmart, UNICEF, 3M, Sony, small-time players. Now, Liane does not like to be introduced on stage as a PhD because she's like, I'm going to get on stage, I'm going to be like the psychologist, and people are going to be like, oh no, she's going to judge me. But Liane is actually Dr. Liane Davey, and I personally feel like anybody who has a PhD should be called doctor all the time because you earned that shit. That's really, really good. So Dr. Liane Davey, you are a badass. You are amazing. You are an expert on conflicts, but you're also my dear friend. So I'm so excited to have you here today.
I'm so excited to be here.
Welcome to Big Talk. Listen, I want to talk about big talk. And for me, conflict is like the biggest kind of talk you can have. And I hate conflict. I'm like super conflict averse. So here's the question I want to ask you.
Okay.
Why am I just be my psychologist here, right? We're going to use this PhD, right? We're going to use it from the very beginning. Why am I so bad at conflict for myself? Like, I don't even want to negotiate the price of a car. It just feels like horrible and awful. I won't send food back in a restaurant. Like, I just hate conflict. But if you cross someone I love, if you are a bully, if you are somebody who is just being unkind to somebody, if you're punching down, I will get all up in your face like a mama lion. So conflict is weird, right? Like, I'm conflict averse, but I also am not shy to defend somebody. Why is conflict so confusing?
Okay. So, those college essays where you start with since the beginning of time?
Uh-huh.
So it's kind of that.
Okay.
And when I finally stumbled upon this piece of Margaret Mead research recently, all of a sudden I understood. And so somebody asked Margaret Mead, what's the first evidence that humans were lived in civilization cooperatively, that sort of thing, that this tendency to not want to fight, but to get along, what was the first evidence? And she said, it's surprising, but the very first evidence is that 15,000 years ago, we have a bone, a femur, and that femur shows evidence that it was fully broken and fully healed. She said, that means that, because it takes 6 weeks for a femur to heal. She said, that means for 6 weeks, somebody brought food to that person, somebody protected them from predators, et cetera, et cetera. So essentially, we have evidence that for 15,000 years, everything in us has been about band together, cooperate, keep each other alive. So you shouldn't beat yourself up if that truly natural force to cooperate and get along is very strong in you. Now, if we play that out to the situation that you're talking about, how come I can then come to the rescue of some? Well, for exactly the same reason, because at that time, 15,000 years ago, we started to figure out who was us and who was them. And so we are incredibly cooperative, conflict averse in our tribes, because that's how we stayed safe from the saber-toothed tiger. But we are pugilistic. We are quick to judge, quick to defend when we're talking about somebody outside our tribe. And so what's happening is something is triggering you to feel like somebody's threatening your people. And then, watch out. So that's what's going on. And so as soon as I heard that piece of research, I was like, okay, well, then I need to stop beating myself up about not liking conflict, because that's a lot of evolution, really sponsoring people who are conflict averse, at least within our groups.
Okay, wait. So you just said that you had to stop beating yourself up for not liking conflict. But you wrote a book about conflict and why conflict is awesome. So like how did you learn to Okay, did you learn to love conflict, or did you just
No.
learn to understand how conflict isn't really conflict, but it's sort of moving forward? Like, how did, because, my next question was gonna be like, so were you really like an argumentative kid? Like, did you always like conflict? Do you love it? Because like I think some of us, it just like you just get the like the hormones like pumping into your stomach, the cortisol going,
Yeah,
going,
yeah,
going, and it just feels bad. I grew up in a house where my dad he had no problem with conflict, and he would be like, give other people ulcers, don't get ulcers. And I'm like, neither one of those sounds good,
yeah.
bro. I don't like it.
Yeah.
So you came to this because you didn't like
Oh,
conflict.
yeah. Yeah, no, I grew up in a house where, my dad was in my life for 43 years, never heard him raise his voice. 43 years, never once. My mother didn't raise her voice either. Like, we did not do conflict. So I was terrible at it.
Plus you're
Plus,
Canadian, so
yeah, well, that's a big problem. So people think that Canadians don't do conflict. No, we do lots of conflict. It's just all passive aggressive. So
Okay.
yeah, we just stab you in the back, not the
Yep.
front. So
Okay. Okay.
Canadians are nice thing. That's a bit of a naive view. It's really Canadians are passive aggressive, so watch out. Um,
Okay, that's good to know.
yeah,
That's
yeah, yeah, because
news
you
you
know a
can
lot of
use.
Canadians. Yeah, yeah, watch out. So no, I am terrible at this. Here's the metaphor, and you're a fitness person, so you might not relate to this in the same way that I do, but I despise exercise, like pretty much in any form. Oh, dance. I do love to dance. So dance is my form of exercise, but all other forms. And at some point, a few years ago now, I was starting to get a really sore back. And so facilitating for 8 hours a day on my feet with a sore back was really aversive.
Mm,
And I ultimately figured out that it was because I had no abdominal strength. And so I
that'll do it.
decided,
Yeah.
oh crap, I better actually get a trainer and go to the gym and do something about this. So like for 10 minutes 3 times a week in those trainer sessions, he made me do the most cruel and unusual abdominal exercises you could ever imagine. And every time, like, you start with plank and you're like, this is awful. And then when you kind of were like, it's awful, but okay, then he'd be like, let's put your arms on a Bosu ball while you do plank, right? And then let's put your arms on a Bosu ball and your feet on a full ball. Like he could, my favorite one, those little um like 10-cent little plastic toys you get that's a little ball in a maze.
Uh-huh.
He would put that on the Bosu ball with my arms on and you had to like actually get the ball in the maze while holding a plank. I'm like, you're a sick man.
The lesson
So,
here is that the trainer always wins.
oh yeah, well,
They
that's
can
totally
all they
true.
can always up the game.
But where I got to was 10 minutes 3 times a week of pain, discomfort made my entire life so much better. So I haven't had back pain in like 8 years. I'm very comfortable on my feet all day. And I actually had the epiphany about fitness before I had it about conflict, but it's the exact same epiphany. So I don't need to like doing abs. I just need to do them. And if I do them, life gets more comfortable. I don't need to like having conflicts. I just need to do it. And if I do 3 hard 10-minute conversations a week, then the rest of my life gets a lot more comfortable. So that was the epiphany I had. So I will be conflict averse and fitness averse to the day I die. I'm quite confident in that. But, as of a decade ago, I just decided I will not be conflict avoidant or fitness avoidant.
Okay, so that's a really interesting differential. Conflict averse versus conflict avoidant.
Yeah.
And I, it's funny, I can actually relate to the fitness story, even though I am an athlete. There are certain things that I have to do as an athlete that I hate to do, that are horrible, but they allow me to be better at the stuff that I
Right.
enjoy doing, right?
Right.
Like, do I like doing core? No, nobody likes doing core, but it's really hard to run a marathon and be on your feet for 4 hours supporting your entire upper body when you're exhausted if you have no core strength, right? So like you
Yeah.
have to do it.
Yeah.
And I literally just said to my trainer a couple days ago, I was like, so it's probably time that I start putting core back into my weekly plan, huh? And he looked at me with one of those like, duh, like looks on his face, like, obviously, right? You're not already doing that. I thought you were doing that without me, like, but I think it's a lesson that you have to keep relearning, right? Because
Yeah.
each time I don't know. Like, I think there's a lot of different kinds of conflict, right? Like, there's
Yeah,
conflict within your family. So, like,
yeah.
with people that you love, there's conflict with like random strangers on the internet about politics. There's conflict in your workplace with, the people that work with you or maybe work for you or maybe you work for, right? There's so
Mhm.
many different kinds of, and then there's like the conflict of like negotiating a car, right? Like some people see that
Yeah.
as a game. I talked about that earlier. So, can you be conflict averse or conflict avoidant in some places and not others? And are
Yeah.
there ways that you can learn from some of those areas to like build your conflict muscles, if you will, in the same way that you're building your core muscles?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So I'm getting better and better and better at conflict at work, and I still hate conflict in my family. And so, yeah, I try to have moments where I'm like, okay, well, how would I have this conversation with a client,
Yes.
and and think about it that way. And actually, it was a bit of a breakthrough with my older daughter. A few years ago now, she came home. She was in grade 10, and she was a real music kid, and she like played clarinet and tenor saxophone and sang in the choir, and she was just really into music. And then in grade 10 there was this new music teacher. She came home one day and she goes, I hate my music teacher. I was like, whoa, I'm trying to raise decent human beings.
Like,
And
that's a strong
so
word. Yeah.
yeah. And so I did like the cardinal rule, like I broke the cardinal rule of conflict. I just looked at her and I said, you don't hate your music teacher. Like I completely invalidated her. And so she stormed off, and I lost the privilege of talking to her about school for about 3 weeks when I finally realized, okay, I totally blew that. I need to go back and do a do over. And so I said, hey, I blew that. You know, it must really suck that you hate your music teacher because you've always loved music. What's that about? What's going on? And it turned out, of course, that the terrible mother in me had been like, this is finally the music teacher who's figured out that you never take that saxophone home and you haven't practiced all year.
Right.
Um,
Right.
and she said, she's bullying my friend Gibby. And he spends almost the entire hour and 20-minute class in the hallway every day. And I hate how she treats him. And it's so unfair. And my kid, she is like
Yes.
a social justice crusader.
Yes.
She's one who will not defend herself, but will defend others. And so that's what was wrong. And I had been making this assumption all along, which is just exactly how we have terrible conflict. And once I understood that, then I could, first of all, when I said, oh my goodness, that's awful. I know how much you hate when people use their power for things like that. Then we're having a conversation. And then I can say, all right, so first of all, we need to talk about how you can help your friend. And then we need to talk about how you don't lose your love of music because of this, or how you don't end up penalized in your own mark because of that. And of course, once I was willing to speak her truth first, then then it was a conversation, and then she was willing to engage with me. So it was kind of learning that, what I call the validation technique, which is speaking their truth first, and then being curious and that sort of thing. Learning that for work, writing about it in the book, and then applying it to teenagers. I did kind of come in from learning it at work first, and then get better at doing it at home. And so it's way, way, way better now.
Yeah, I love that. Years ago, I mean, many years ago, as you know, my eldest is a freshman in college right now, so just a year behind your daughter. I was talking to an old colleague of mine, and their kids were maybe about 6 or 7 years older than mine, and I was like, God, you've got such great relationships with your daughters. Like, how do you do it? Like, that's amazing. Like, what do you do? And she gave me a bunch of tips, and one of them was like, never let go of the hug first, and always kind of like just kind of be around, and the sort of windshield time thing. But one of the things she said was never solve their problems. And I thought she was trying to tell me like, don't be a helicopter parent, don't come in and solve
Yeah.
the problem. But she was like, no, she's like, don't just rush in for the answer. She's like, if you rush in for the answer, not only do they not feel good about themselves, you
Right.
don't teach them how to get better, but they leave feeling like they're the victim, they're the weaker, they're the ones who have to be helped.
Yep.
But what she said was like, the response when they come to you with something that's wrong, like your first response should be like, oh,
Yeah.
that sucks,
Yeah.
I'm
Like
sorry
very
you're going
few
through that.
words.
And I was like,
Very
"Wait, huh?" And
yeah.
then, like, I got on stage and I was doing live coaching on stage and somebody came up and they, like, told me their problem and I was like, "Okay, well, here's the things that you should do." And then I was like, "Wait a
Uh-oh.
minute." And I have to admit the only reason why I did it differently was because somebody told me a problem that I didn't quite know the answer to immediately. So I stopped and I went, "Wow, that's a really that's a
Right.
really big problem." And I saw her entire face change. And then I was
Yeah.
like, "Oh," and then I turned to the audience. I'm like, "Can we give her a round of applause for being so brave?" And everybody applauded. And then during that time, I was like, "Okay, think, think, think,
Right,
think, think."
right, right, right,
And
right,
then
right.
I was able to start asking her questions. And as I
Yeah.
was asking her questions, I could come up with the answer. But it like not it wasn't just that I was like validating her. It actually bought me time
Right.
to be better. So
Yeah.
I mean, it's such an interesting technique because it sort of starts. I mean, totally selfishly, it starts with them, but it really, really helps you because then
Well,
you get more
it helps
information.
the issue. It helps you get to and one of the things is that so it's very much true of children, don't solve their problems,
Yeah.
but it's the biggest thing that goes wrong in cross-functional teams is I see people try and solve a problem of somebody in a different expertise or a different role or a different
Yes.
department, and they usually blow it because they don't know enough. They right and so they look dumb because the response is often like, well, that'll never work.
Right.
B, they do send that sign that I don't have confidence in you to solve this problem, which is yours
Right.
to solve. So in cross-functional teams, I'm constantly talking about one of the best things you can do is actually share what's the problem, but leave space for, I would love your take on how we solve this or what our options are or those sorts of things. So that's a really key tip is, not only don't solve your kids' problems, but don't try and solve other people's problems on a cross-functional team either. And unfortunately, we've been told over and over again, this don't come to me with a problem, come with a solution. And that's okay to your boss, but don't do that in a cross-functional team. People feel like you're condescending toward them, that you think you know better, that you don't have confidence that they can solve it themselves, and you make yourself vulnerable to looking like a dolt because that was a really dumb suggestion you just made.
Yeah. Okay. So if you are listening to this podcast, Dr. Liane Davey, New York Times bestselling author and organizational psychologist, has released you from having to ever solve anybody's problem
Solve
ever
your own.
again.
Just solve your own.
Just solve your own damn
Yeah,
problems.
solve your own
Um,
damn problems.
solve your own
Yeah.
damn- I mean, listen, we could all be pretty busy with just solving our own damn problems. That is
Exactly.
a full-time job, solving our own problems.
Yeah.
So that that's so okay. So somebody comes to you with a problem and your first response is to see them, right? To actually
Yeah.
see them and validate them, be like, wow, that sounds like a hard problem. Do you then start saying, like, do you then start launching into your ideas, or do you ask them more questions
Yeah.
about it, or do you say, like, well, do you have to also like determine what their appetite is for a solution? Like sometimes, like, sometimes my kids come to me and I'm like, so do you want a pity party? Do you want a
Right.
brainstorming session? Do you want a solution? Like what
Right.
what are- what are you coming to me for? And
That's
I'm
great
happy to do
advice.
any of them, but
Yeah, that's great advice for people who are, for managers often, right? So, definitely saying, how can I help? What do you need? That's a MBS question, right? How can I
yeah.
help? It's a great question. So, what do you need from me? That sort of thing. And yeah, the more I think with your kids and with your own direct reports and things like that, it is fun to be able to say, like, do you just need a pity party? Because I have the hat and streamers,
Yeah.
I'll,
You got to
I'll
do
set
it
it up.
nicely, right? So they don't think you're condescending to them,
But
obviously, but
one of the things that I use a lot in my work is humorous, safe language, because somehow the humorous language diffuses it. So, like, if you can be in that position where pity party is an actual thing, like if I was a manager in a team, I would actually have like a pity party hat like sitting on my desk, and
yeah.
like I would just take the hat, hand one over, like, is that what you need? Because I got you. It's
Yeah.
amazing how a little bit of humor and agreed upon shared language diffuses a situation. Like, even just doing that, you're like, okay, I guess you're right. I think I just do need a pity party for a minute.
Right.
The other thing I used to have when I was a manager in an office was this little funny egg timer. And it was like, okay, just let me flip it over. You have like 2 full minutes to just vent. I will say nothing. I'll just wear
Yes.
my pity party hat, go. All right. And at the end, I'll blow my I'll blow my pity party horn. So it's amazing how sometimes this language, these inside jokes, this sort of thing can diffuse conflict in a way that's really constructive. Don't do it unless it's shared, right? Like, as you said,
Right.
if you're judging them with pity party, if pity party is your language and not yours as an individual, not yours as a relationship, it doesn't work. But as
Yes.
a team, as a manager and a direct report, you can have your I have an exercise that I give away for free, a set of 9 different team effectiveness exercises, like icebreakers for virtual teams. And one of them is like, what do you need? I forget all the categories now, but one of them is, do you need validation? Or one of them is, do you need resuscitation? And there's like a list, and you can actually say, I need this one today. Like, I need resuscitation, which is, tell me how great I am, remind me why I'm doing this job, versus validation, which is like, yeah, okay, like, I get why you're feeling that way. And so you can actually have language to ask for what you need. So I think that really helps.
Yeah, there was some, video going around on social media about, like, a teacher, standing outside a classroom. I don't know if you've seen it, where, like, the teacher's out of the classroom, and there's a poster, and on the poster, there's, like, a hand that says "high five," and there's, like, arms that says "hug," and there's a face and with a smile, and each kid, like, walks up and, like, they, like, tap on the poster exactly, like, where they need it, and then she
Yeah.
gives them what they need in that moment, and it's
Yeah.
such an
I love
incredible thing.
that video. That like, I just got the goosebumps, literally. Like, that video gives me the goosebumps. So, yeah, so I have a sort of adult team version of that.
I love that. I love that. And the thing is, like, I think that do you think that sometimes maybe we know what we want, but if there isn't somebody creating the shared language and the framework and the structure, we don't ask for it almost because
Yeah.
that feels like conflict. Like it's
Yeah,
hard to ask for what
of
you
course.
want.
Or selfishness or neediness or any of these other things, right? So we put so much in the way of just getting what we need to be our best. And we think it's selfish. I'm like, it is not selfish to put yourself in a position as a teammate to be fully present, to be like open and listening, and any of those sorts of things. So it's not selfish in that sense. It's like, here, just now, if what you need is 600 thread count linen sheets, okay, like, sure, that's diva territory. But if what you're saying is, today I just really need somebody to take a look at this and tell me if I'm on the right track, or I need encouragement, or whatever it is, yeah, that's not selfish. That's putting yourself in a position to be able to contribute. If you deplete yourself, you're no good to your team at all.
Yeah, as you know, I gave a TEDx on this question of like, how can I help being the
Yeah.
wrong question. Sorry, MBS, Michael Bungaystein, you're brilliant. I love you. You've been a guest. But like the question of what do you need, right? Like what does the problem need to be solved? Not necessarily how can I help
Yeah.
is such a more important question. But I think I should give another talk on how you ask the question or how you
Yeah.
say, here's what I need, right? I
Right.
think we're all really shy about that because we've been taught that it is selfish when in
Right.
fact it's really not a selfish thing because you're saying like here's what I need in order to help get this project done, in order to get to the right place, in order to support this family, this business, this team, whatever it is better.
Yeah, I just did a video on my YouTube channel on the problem with agreeing to disagree. I get that in
Oh yes, I want to
right?
talk about that.
People who are conflict avoidant, and they'll just be like, well, we'll have to agree to disagree. And my thing is like, agree to disagree is only allowed in what's the best flavor of gelato and who was the best Batman. Other than that, agree to disagree is uncool, because essentially what you're doing is saying, let's agree to leave this large gaping wound open in our team or our relationship. So when I go through what is a disagree and commit process, one is just say out loud that this is not a decision that I originally agreed with, but I am committing to move forward to make it successful. Secondly, talk about, okay, therefore, this is what I'm going to do. But third is say what you need to be able to do that. So if, somebody's making a decision to deprioritize your team's project, and you say, okay, I get that. I'm all on board to help this other project be successful. What I need is for that project leader to come to my team meeting so that my team can ask questions about that decision, so that they can feel heard. and I need to know that you've got a plan to redeploy those 3 people. And then if I have those things, I will be the biggest supporter of this shift in direction. It's not selfish to say what you need to be able to disagree and commit to a decision. It's mature. It's being a great team player. So it's just a very specific context where I think asking for what you need makes all the difference in the world. And then it says to your team, hey, I'm going to commit and go all in, but there's a relationship here. And that means I need something in return to be able to do that. So yeah, getting good in conflict at, yes, disagree and commit, but also asking for what you need to be able to be all in with that. I think it's really important.
So, you talk a lot about this idea of conflict debt, which was a concept I'd never heard before I read The Good Fight when I first
Yeah.
got to know you, and I think that conflict debt I think is super interesting because you have a conflict on a day.
Yeah.
Right. And then like you have that conflict, but if you don't address it, you agree to disagree. Right. You forget, you
Yeah.
don't say like, this is what I need from you. This is like, and you just sort of start harboring that ill will and those bad feelings and that resentment and like, all the scorekeeping crap that you got along. And then like it happens again and again and again. And they're all like little things, but then we lash out at the one little thing and you're like,
Right.
well, what? It was just this little thing. What's going on? It's because you have all this sort of conflict debt. And I think it's interesting because you used the back pain analogy. I'll go back to that.
Yeah.
Once you started doing core, it wasn't like your back pain miraculously went away because you still had like inflamed muscles from years of
Yeah.
standing for hours without the core. So it like, even though you were doing work on it, it still took time for that back pain debt to go
Yeah.
away before
Yeah.
you could live without pain.
Yeah.
So, it sounds like not asking for what we need, right, is one of the ways in which we get into conflict debt. How else do we get into conflict debt? And then I want to talk a little bit about once we realize we're in it, how we can pull ourselves out of it. Because I think a lot of people are like, well, they just need to, or if only he did, or when she does this, it's like, it's got to be, we have to do it, right? It's got to be inside.
That's a really good guarantee to ensure you're going to stay in conflict debt.
Right.
So how do we get into conflict debt? So we can either avoid the issue altogether, which is like, that's the undiscussables, right? Like we just don't go there. What one of my clients referred to as the too hard pile. He's like, oh
The
yeah, that's
too
on the
hard
too hard
pile.
pile. I'm like, you
Okay.
have a pile? He's like, oh yeah. So there's the too hard pile. There's the we talk about the issue, but I'm really careful to only talk about it with people who I know will agree with me. And this happens in organizations all the time. Like
Hmm.
something goes way too far in one department without inviting anybody from another department because you know that they're gonna, have issues with it or whatever. So that's another form of conflict debt. It's like, oh
Yes.
no, LGO and I talked about it, and we think it's a great idea, and yet we intentionally did not ask somebody else to join the conversation because we knew they'd be like, here's what's wrong with that
Yes.
idea. So that's the
Yes.
second form of conflict debt. And the third form of conflict debt is to kind of broach the issue, but always keeping it so tidy and keeping the temperature low enough. And if it gets a little too hot, you know exactly what the line is, right? It's like, let's take that offline.
Hmm.
That's what we say, right? Like, ooh, this is getting a little uncomfortable. Let's take it offline.
Yes.
And take it offline means just let's bury it in a deep, dark hole and never speak of it again. So,
Yes. Let's put it in the too hard pile.
too hard pile. Yeah. So you can avoid it altogether. You can only talk about it with people who are going to tend to agree with you, or you can talk about it, but superficially and not
Hmm.
actually get at the underlying issues. All of those
Hmm.
are
Hmm.
different forms of getting into conflict debt. Gets you to the same place though.
Resentment, festering,
Oh yeah.
sadness,
Well,
depression,
so those are all the
anger.
individual things for sure. All the stress, anxiety, resentment, right? Cortisol coursing through your body on a prolonged basis. But there's all the team stuff, right? So eroded trust, disengagement, the inefficiency of when you don't trust one another because you rework each other's work. But then at the macro level, it's terrible for productivity. If you avoid conflict, you're also not good at spotting or mitigating risks. You're not good at innovation. So conflict debt is costing us at all these different kind of levels. So
Yeah, I saw on your website something like $359 million or $1 billion a year lost in the United States to conflict. Like
yeah,
that's
Yep.
That's a now problem.
The average North American manager spends 4 hours a week on nothing but managing intra-team conflict.
I sold my executive search firm because I just got to a point where I couldn't handle conflict anymore. It was just draining me.
Yeah, well,
I just
conflict debt, sometimes you feel like the only answer is bankruptcy.
is exit, is get
Yeah,
me the hell out of
bankruptcy.
here.
Just, I'm
Yeah.
out. I don't want to pay these debts. I'm just going to declare bankruptcy
Oh,
and get the
stop
hell
yelling at me, Liane. Stop yelling at me.
out. Yeah, I did it too. Like my first job, I was so naive and got into huge conflict debt with my boss, and it was just ugly. And I didn't know how to deal with it, and I didn't want to deal with it, so I just quit because declaring bankruptcy was way easier than digging out. And the metaphor, is the gift that keeps giving, because the other thing I had done is destroyed my credit rating, and so
Mm.
then it gets harder and harder and harder to pay off the conflict debt if nobody trusts you anymore, or so yeah, it's a big problem.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting with my firm, it was my job to be like 18 to 24 months ahead of the market,
Right.
coming up with solutions my clients didn't even realize that, the problems they didn't realize they had yet.
Right.
And my team, if their job was to do the work of the current clients, right? So like the better I got at my job, the further out I was looking out over the horizon of innovation. And the better my team was, the more in touch they were with like this week, this month. Maybe if I was lucky, they were thinking about this quarter, but they were like working on the projects. So what excited me and what excited them was very different. And I wanted to keep innovating and changing, and they wanted to keep working on the today problems. And I was like, let's go, let's build a bigger engine. They were like, can we just take the car on the road and see how fast we can drive it? We like the car we have. Can we just be here? And there was, even though we weren't in conflict, like I didn't want to,
Yeah.
buy a whole new database, or I didn't want to, change the vacation policy or whatever. It's still like our priorities were in conflict. What excited me and what excited them and what
Your
I got paid to
attention.
do.
Yeah, your attention didn't
Yes.
match anymore, right?
Yes.
Yeah, so
Yes.
you're onto something really interesting. I co-authored a book about leadership a long time ago now, and somebody it was editing it, looking at the first version. He said, you never defined leadership in this book about leadership. I'm like, interesting. So in the recent years, I've been really interested in kind of theory about management and leadership. And what's happened is we call managers leaders now, which is
Yeah.
just another one of our conflict avoidant bullshit, politically
Mhm.
correct crap things that we do, which is that, leader is more impressive and more important. So we just call everybody a leader. But what we've done is we've devalued management. And so the role of a manager is to optimize the status quo. And the role of a leader is to change it, to transform. And so what's happening in that story is you were missing the management layer. You were not built to be a manager. So
No.
you didn't have the people who were there to help them optimize the status quo. And so the gap between the people delivering on the status quo and you trying to transform it was that there was no management in the middle optimizing the status quo. But when I help people understand management and leadership are not the same thing, and yes, the same individuals often manage and lead, but you have to understand that those things are very much in tension with one another. Optimizing the status quo versus transforming it, those are two entirely different things. And there can be huge conflict that comes if we don't understand which mode we're in. It's a great thing around meeting effectiveness, where if you're trying to do one of those things in a meeting, you're not likely going to be effective at doing the other. So there's a lot to learn from that example, because, there is something, and there is a profession of management, there is a skill set of management, and then there's leadership, and they're different. And so if we have that gap, no wonder there was conflict there.
That, you just, like, blew my brains out of my skull with that. I've never, I've understood for a long time that I was a leader and that I was crap at management.
Yeah.
I understood that,
Yeah. Yeah.
and it took me a while to get there. It took me, having what I think was a pretty abusive conflict with one of my team members, me being abusive to her, to realize that I should never do that ever again. Like, it was awful and bad and horrible. And I said things to her. I think I've told you the story before about the compliment sandwich where she sat me down and told me that I had to tell her a nice thing to say about her work because, she wanted to like be open to my criticism. And then I needed to give her my criticism and she wagged her finger at me. I was like, but it needs to be constructive. And then she was like, and then you need to tell me a second nice thing to say about my work. Cause that's the sandwich. And I was like, the problem with that advice is that I can't think of a second nice thing to say about your work.
That's
Maybe
so I've always
unkind.
heard that talked about as the shit sandwich. And
Exactly. Like
yeah,
nobody says
and
I want a rye sandwich. They're like, I want a
right,
pastrami sandwich. Like it's the
right.
shit sandwich.
Yeah, it's a shit sandwich, and it's terrible, terrible, terrible advice. Don't do
Yes.
it. Just she had been taught that somewhere.
In her
But of
MBA
course,
program, she was
yeah.
taught that, and then she decided to tell me how to manage people of her generation.
Oh God. Well, so the other problem with it is that if you know that all you're getting is just bread there, so that you don't have to hold the pastrami in your fingers, you devalue the positive as well. So
Yes.
it's really important to decouple. You want to make sure that people are getting positive feedback, absolutely, but that's not as a way of softening or being indirect about feedback about things that need to change.
Yes.
Oh my God. Yeah. Oh,
Yeah.
I can rant on that.
Yes. Well, and so it was in that moment that I realized that I am a very bad manager. And I loved being a leader. I loved thinking about the innovation and thinking about where we were going and shining the spotlight on my team and celebrating them and just being all about the culture and who we were and why we do this work. And it's so important. Our clients deserve our best and all of that. And I was really good at that, but I was really bad at the management piece. And I had thought that they were the same thing. And I think sometimes what happens is that people become doers and then they become managers and then they become leaders without
Right.
any training about, and what I didn't realize until you just said this is that it's not a ladder of doer and manager and leader. It's sort of doer and then manager and leader are both sort of equally important, really great, huge
Exactly.
roles.
And
And
very
we don't think
different.
about it. Very,
Very
very
different.
different.
I often
Yeah.
tell leaders that, like, if you are both a manager and a leader, management is an activity. So you need to make time for management in your calendar. Management is coaching, management is planning, all those sorts of things. Management is an activity. Leadership is a lens. And so
Ah,
you don't need to schedule leadership. You need to be wearing leadership as a lens in every activity you're doing, whether it's, so if you were meeting with a search client, you're doing the actual work, you're producing work, trying to figure out the spec. But as a leader, you're in that conversation thinking about, how am I noticing that the way people are talking about talent is changing? And how could I be out ahead of that? So management is an activity, leadership is a lens. Management is about optimizing the status quo, which is why managers often drive leaders crazy, because they take what are often constrained and unideal situations and they do their best with it, which frustrates the hell out of leaders that are like, dream bigger, we can be more.
okay. So then here's the question for all the entrepreneurs that are listening that are like, oh, yeah, that makes me crazy. So when I did have that abusive experience with that, when let me own that. When I abused that staff member of mine, let me
Yeah.
just own that. I called a mentor of mine and I was like, oh man, I just did the worst thing ever. It was really bad. And he was like, you know what you need? You need someone to manage your people. Like I just didn't care that little Johnny had an ear infection again. It was like, I figured my
Right.
shit out. Figure your shit out. Get your work done. Like,
Right.
let's just like, so he introduced me to somebody who was working for him, who was kind of getting hosed by the company that we had both worked for.
Yes.
So I meet her for lunch and we have the same shared language. We have the same shared values, the same shared, this is what quality looks like. Cause we were trained by one of the best search
Yeah.
firms in the world. And she loves listening to the fact that little Johnny has an ear infection again. Like she loves it. She loves the like everyday quality improvement. Ugh, barf, right? I can't stand it. She loves it. Um, She's a PhD in psychology. She's a classically trained cellist. She has this beautiful blonde bob. She's from Atlanta, Georgia, and has a nice little Southern accent. She's like all brains to my like all Brooklyn Jew heart. God, let's go. we were a perfect combination. And we're running the company then for the next 10 years. But I am constantly in the like, let's dream big. And she's constantly in the like, how do we manage our people better? So even though we got along very well, we started having conflict because
Good.
I wanted to keep like pulling us over the next hurdle of innovation. And she was like, how do we create structure and systems? And I was
Good.
like, I can't stand it. So if
That's
you're like an entrepreneur and you've gotten to the point where you're like, okay, I can't lead and manage, they're both not my skill set. And I want to make sure I'm doing the thing that I love and that
yeah.
I'm really good at. So I'm going to bring someone in to do the other thing. How do you then not just replace the conflict that you had, right? Managing when you want to be leading or leading when you want to be managing with the person that you're bringing in to help solve the problem.
Okay, let's introduce another nuance in conflict. So I talk about productive conflict and unproductive conflict. And the words I use, productive conflict is tension. So tension stretches you, it makes things bigger, versus friction. Friction wears you down. So you
Mm.
want that sweet, awesome, brilliant PhD from Atlanta having conflict with you all the time. Actually, that's what you're paying her for. You're paying her to make sure that your big blue sky crazy ideas don't drive your company out of business because you can't make a buck.
Yes.
You are paying her, valuing her, loving her for the tension that she's going to put on your blue sky thinking. She is loving you, valuing you, choosing to work in your firm for the tension you're going to put on her to not just always do it the same way, but to dream bigger. So we want tension. Tension makes us, it hurts, it's uncomfortable, it's a stretch, but it's the kind of conflict that every healthy team should have lots of. I always say, if you are not having tension, you shouldn't be having a meeting. If you have a meeting and there is no tension, cancel the meeting.
You're just having a tea party.
Right. Ooh, not that we don't love a tea party,
We
but
love a tea party.
yeah, friction is what you don't want. And friction would come from you not valuing the importance of management, not respecting her expertise in how to set up good processes and structures, or any of those other, or her not respecting that this company can't be the same 2 years from now as it is today. Friction comes from not listening effectively, all those sorts of things. Not being decisive. Friction comes from, are you kidding me? Are we having this conversation still? So any healthy team, healthy relationship, needs to have lots and lots and lots of tension for always and forever, and have as little friction as is humanly possible. So what I'd say to the entrepreneur is find people that you love being in tension with.
Okay.
Yes.
So I want to spend a little more time on this.
Okay.
I always ask my guests to come up with 3 nouns to describe them. And you only gave me one, watercooler psychologist.
Oh, sorry.
By the way,
Breaking the rules again.
tension. But I did say high tea lover as one of your
Yes.
as one of your nouns because we had glorious high tea in London, and I
And we
cannot
will
wait
have
to do it again.
another.
We will have another. So Rich Bracken says, "I love this. My new response to a meeting invites. Is this a meeting or a tea party?" So
Rich, yes, do it and tell me what they say.
this is what I want to know. Rich is a phenomenal, incredible keynote speaker. Also, he's just absolutely fantastic and smart and energetic, and I just adore him. So I'm so glad that he's here listening. So here's my question. So if if you're a conflict averse person like I am, and you know that you're going to have that weekly meeting with the person who is going to just poke holes and all the things that you bring, like, my husband, he is a guy who thinks about risk all day long. He thinks about
Yes.
numbers all day long. I am like blue sky dreamer. What if maybe we should? Wouldn't it be great if? And he's like, let's talk about risk. So, we jokingly call him the party of no, because I'll be like, what if we? And he's like, let me pop that balloon. Right. Let me just so I'll say to him, like, I want to present an idea. I don't want you to pop my balloon yet. Right. Shared language,
Tell
humor.
them what
Right.
you
We have
need.
that. I
Yep.
tell him what I need.
Yep.
But there are moments, and there were moments in my company where, like, I knew that I wanted to sit down with my partner, the manager, and present this, like, hey, I was just on a 6-hour plane with no Wi-Fi. So I had all this time to think, and I came up with these ideas, and I
She's
just
like,
knew.
oh no, she's on a plane with no Wi-Fi.
You don't understand. Like my team used to check. This is after there was always Wi-Fi on planes, and they would check to see if there was Wi-Fi on my plane because they knew that if there wasn't, I would come off that plane and there would be like a whole new compensation structure, or we would have an entirely new sales pitch plan. It was just like, oh God, Laura is just trapped with herself. Um,
Yeah.
but I knew that the response that I would get from that, from the
Yeah.
thing that I love to do more than anything else, is the like, yeah, but, and the balloon popping and the rocks in the shoes. And it just like over time would just grate and grate and grate on
Yeah,
me.
that's friction.
So I
Yeah.
should know in my soul that they're doing it because they love me and they want to make the idea better. That's why they're still working in my firm. But I couldn't get myself wrapped around that. And it just felt very hard and heavy and exhausting.
Yeah,
So
and I think we need to build the skills. So, I think with them, I would be saying, okay, uh, they should be asking you, okay, Laura, what's this about? Right? So when you were on that plane, so this goes back to that you're solving the problem without first engaging them on that there is a problem or what the problem is. So that's why they were terrified of you on a plane, is because you would go from deciding there is a problem and figuring out how to solve it without engaging them. That's very invalidating. It's
yes,
very frustrating.
I was skipping
So
to like step 5.
yeah. And
Mm.
and that just says to people, I don't need you. It's like when people present a draft in a beautiful PowerPoint presentation that's already got all the stock images in it and whatever, I'm like, all you are saying to your teammates is, just to be clear, I don't need you or value anything you're going to say because I've gone to finish draft without you. So that's what you were doing. So,
Mm.
ideally,
Yes.
it's the 15-minute call before you get on the plane to say, hey, I'm thinking about this. Um, you know, if I were to spend some time without Wi-Fi on the plane, first of all, how do you see that issue? What should I be paying attention to? What's my value on the problem? What would you like me thinking about? Those kinds of questions that get alignment about the nature of the problem first. Then you could go off, do something draft. Make sure I will often send things in PowerPoint in the default Microsoft PowerPoint template of like Arial font and like ugly, because when you send it that way, that just says to people, this is just a start. I want your input.
Oh, you're
So you have
so
the plane,
clever.
you send it to someone's, in that kind of raw form, and then you engage. So what was happening was you felt invalidated, but actually you kind of invalidated them first, which is what
Yes.
was going on.
But what if they're just gonna be wrong? Like, what if
Yeah.
they don't know because they don't have the lens into the world that I have, and we wanna move fast and break
Yeah.
things and get things done, and I can't bring them like, is that a failure? I guess that's a failure of my leadership that I'm not able to show them the world through my lens. Like, I need
No,
to make
I
a little
think that
viewfinder and like.
I think that happens, and then the question is who owns the decision? And
Mm,
if you own the decision, to me, the responsibility of a decision maker is to make sure that we're not arrogant about what we know and understand, that we have actively solicited people who have different perspectives, different stakeholders, see risk differently, can spot our assumptions. But once you've done those things, then it's totally cool to say, thank you for raising that. I've heard that risk. I'm going to proceed anyway, or like whatever else you've said to validate that I heard you, I got that. And then you say, I'm making this call and I'm counting on you to help me make this successful. It's okay to have people disagree with you. I think if we jump straight to, I'm the leader, this is my call, that kind of arrogance is not going to build strong relationships. It's not going to give us the kind of discretionary, because what people will start to do they will delegate everything up. Well, Laura's going to decide that anyway, so I'm not going to bother worrying about it. So in the attention management economy, you've just ensured that you've lost all of that attention to issues where they could be actually giving you. The other thing is we don't do enough to say who owns the what decision and who owns the how decision. So you could say, look, I own the decision about what we're going to do here, but I'm not going to own how we do it. This is what needs to happen. So I'm like, I don't know enough. I'm not on the ground. I'm not the manager. So I would love for you to bring all of your value in defining how we implement that decision.
Mhm.
So that's the old, you're a parent, right? I get to decide you have to go to bed clean. You get to decide whether it's a bath or a shower. Knock yourself out, or a garden hose, whatever. I'm open to you controlling that. So that's another thing we don't do in conflict enough, is get clear about. Sometimes we fight, we're trying to make the decision about what we do, and we're actually fighting about how we implement it. It's like, okay, let's just back up and figure out what the business needs to happen here, and then we can talk about how we implement it. So those are a few things that also we can pull apart. But just in your example, it's really about, am I letting the people on my team add value? And
Yes.
if I'm not, I can be pretty sure that they'll stay around for a while, disgruntled, not paying attention to anything, not adding much value, and then they'll leave, because
Yes.
there are places where
Yes.
we feel we can make a meaningful contribution. And
So
you on a plane for 6 hours was just saying to them, I can bake this without you.
yes, yes, and that's what I would do, not to be super arrogant here, but, like, for the most part, I knew what the problems were, and I knew what their problems were,
Yep.
so I was able to solve the problem, but because they didn't feel seen in the
Right.
problem, they didn't feel like I was solving their problem, even though I was. They were like, "Well, she's just doing this thing, and, oh, it happens to benefit me, but that's not why she did it." So, like,
Yeah, the
I
call
missed the
from the
leadership
gate.
part of it, right? There was, like,
Yeah,
the
the
what and the
call
how,
from
but
the
I missed the
gate is
why.
just, I've been listening to you guys. I've heard you the last few weeks, and I get the sense you're wrestling with this. If I were to spend some time thinking about it on the plane, I still have the, who holds a phone like this anymore?
I know, I do
Um,
the same thing.
yeah. If I, right? So even just, showing them that I got this idea from listening to you, did I interpret it correctly? And if the answer is yeah, yeah, that's then great. But it's
Yes.
that 15 minutes at the gate to ask the question before the 6 hours on the
It's
plane.
it's incredible, and I think that that goes to that what you were saying earlier about, like, 10-minute hard conversations gives you back the whole week. Even, like, you
Yeah.
know, 3 of those 10-minute, like, "Hey, am I getting this right?" Right? Opening the door. Rich asked the question, he'd love your thoughts on, how to deal with those who feel threatened by your blue sky ideas to build cohesion. And I think what I'm hearing you say is that part of it is also, like, they can feel less threatened if they feel like they're part of the blue sky
Yeah.
with you.
Yeah, so that's such a huge part of it, right? So if we go back the 15,000 years of us and them, like, what we never want to do to a teammate is all of a sudden make them feel like them, because we
Mhm.
know what humans do to thems. It's not pretty.
It's not pretty. It's not pretty. So let me just we have a few minutes left, and
Okay.
I would be remiss if I didn't ask you about the role of conflict in the virtual workplace that we have now. I know we
Yeah.
could do a whole other show on this, and maybe I'll have you back and we'll do that because I think it's super important. I ran that company, it was all virtual. We were
Yeah.
virtual before it was COVID cool, and I found that I had to be, like, extra communicative and
Yeah.
extra organized and extra structured so that people felt like there were, like, boxes in which they could have these conversations. And um do you think that it's that conflict is different, or, like, that we get into more conflict debt because we're not seeing each other?
Yeah. Yeah. So, so much of our understanding of where our relationship is at with someone is nonverbal.
Mhm.
And so, imagine times in an office where you have a bit of a rough meeting, and you start to see someone just subtly turning their chair and their eye contact away from you. You learn a lot about,
Yes.
they're uncomfortable with this, or they disagree, but they're not saying anything. A lot of passive aggressiveness manifests in the body. And so then you also notice that they've been, like, going the long way around the office to the coffee machine, so they don't have to walk past your desk. And there's all that stuff that, or on the positive side, as the conflict is ending, like, they do make eye contact with you at some point. You're like, oh, okay, things are thawing, right? And then, like, oh, I could say something now. Or and when we're virtual, we're kind of on, click on, everyone's making eye contact with the screen, and then we click off. We're missing a lot of that. So
Yeah.
we're missing a lot of really valuable information, for sure. um as somebody who's conflict averse, there's a lot to be said for conflict virtually because you can be more prepared. So things are more scheduled. So you're not sort of ambushed by somebody who's pissed at you in the kitchen, right? You can actually be prepared. You can have notes, right? So the thing about where your webcam is on your screen is you can stick a sticky note right beside it that says something like, don't forget to smile, or has like the words that you've carefully thought about. Because if you don't want to be judgmental, if you want to not say you were so rude in the meeting this morning, but if you remember to say, right when I started talking, you turned off your camera. You can put stickies. Like you can be better prepared. You don't want to be that person in the office who's like, wait, let me consult the notes I made.
Right.
But in virtual, you can. So there are pros and cons, but I think the biggest con is exactly what you said. We can get into conflict more easily. We can stay there longer with it, seemingly not costing us to have that conflict mounting. The other thing is that in virtual teams, we're in the written communication much more frequently, which has a strong negativity bias. So our friend Nick Morgan cited this research that said when you send a text that says like nice work or great job, 60% of people interpret that as sarcasm.
Oh my gosh.
Terrifying. So we have conflict that's being created in a virtual team because we texted somebody good job. And then they're like, oh, well, right? Like, okay, how did we start a conflict by saying
Okay, literally every single person listening to this podcast right now did not hear like the last sentence you said because all they heard was, "Oh my God, I sent a great job text and now people hate me."
Exactly. Exactly. They think I'm being
So
sarcastic and that I'm
what are we
condescending
supposed
and
to
that.
do? Like longer sentences or?
So great feedback needs to be concrete. So if somebody did a great job, you want to take the moment to think about what was it that made it great. So great job in the presentation this morning. When you chose the Acme example, that seemed like such a great fit for this client that we're talking about. So, I walked away feeling much more confident that the plan was going to work because it was such a great example of where it had worked somewhere similar. So that's sticky. It's really hard to hear that and be like, well, that was sarcastic, right?
And also that feels a lot like management, but also leadership, right?
Yeah.
You're managing, you're teaching them, you're giving them immediate constructive feedback and also sort of setting a lens about this is who we are as a company and what we try to do for our clients at the same
Yeah,
time.
the leader is teaching them what to pay attention to, and then the
Yes.
manager. So yeah, don't say great job on your virtual team. If somebody does a great job, have the courtesy, take the care to actually, interrogate your own judgment. So it's funny because I say we have to interrogate our judgment when we're being negative about people, but it's interesting if we don't practice interrogating our positive judgments. So if I'm like, oh, she was really great, well, what made me think she was great? Is it that she's blonde with beautiful blue eyes? Or was it that she was prepped with really, yes. Or was it that she was prepped? Like clearly she'd read my book and the questions were not questions I'd ever heard before. So if I said, hey, Laura, it was so fun to be on your show because there were a few places where it was so clear you'd read the book. And there were 4 questions you asked that I'd never heard before in 3 years of talking about the good fight. And that just made me feel like you were excited for me to be on the show, right? Like when you interrogate your judgments, practicing with interrogating positive judgments and
Yes.
practicing with really sticky, good feedback, then you're going to be in a much better position to then interrogate all those negative judgments that we are so quick to like. What made
Yes.
me think he was rude in that meeting? What was that? And of course, in virtual teams, a lot of our rude judgments are around somebody turning off their camera when we don't know if they have like a sick kid home with COVID who's like tugging on their shirt, and or somebody who lives in a place that has low bandwidth and is turning it off so they can hear you and pay attention. And so we got to get better at interrogating our judgments, and positive feedback is a great place to practice, because if you get it wrong, the stakes aren't as high as getting judgment wrong on the other side.
I'd also imagine that getting better at the positive stuff makes the negative stuff easier to communicate.
Absolutely. Yeah. And
Because like you
because
pay off the debt, but you probably also have like the like positive platform.
Yeah. Well, you've learned the technique and then you can just go to it over and over. It's like the little black dress of feedback, right? So I'm going to, pair this today with like brights are in season. I'm going to pair it with a yellow bag and yellow pumps. But, once you've got that little black dress of the feedback formula, okay, how do I orient them to what the situation was? How do I describe for them the behavior objectively? How do I share with them and be candid with them about the impact it had on me? And then how do I open up a dialogue? Once you've got that little black dress, you can style it differently, put in positive stuff, put in stuff where you want them to change their behavior. Yeah, and it becomes your go-to.
I love that. Liane, you are incredible. I adore you. I hope that I will see you in September in
Yes,
Montreal.
definitely.
Daniel Pink says, if you feel like your organization is mired in a rut, you definitely need the good fight. Kim Scott, the New York Times bestselling author of Radical Candor, said, we feel the pain of having a conflict immediately, but the pain of avoiding conflict is insidious and invisible, like toxic gas. The good fight, Liane Davey, shows us how to clear the air without causing an explosion. Liane, I think you've helped me learn a lot today. I know you've helped our listeners learn a lot. The Good Fight, you can pick up at any place fine books are sold. But how can people who want to find you for coaching, for consulting, for speaking, how do people find you?
Yeah, so two ways. So you can see lianedavey.com. And what I love about it being on the screen is that when you have two names that are impossible to spell, it's good when you can see it. But the other thing is connect with me on LinkedIn. That's where the action is. So I'm trying to make my LinkedIn the coolest couch on the internet for having the most important conversations we need to have about work. So come sit down on my LinkedIn couch and join the conversation.
And that's Liane Davey, Liane, Davey, Davey. Your LinkedIn is great. You have all these phenomenal photos of you making hilarious faces.
Oh, I know.
And
So
it stops the
embarrassing.
scroll. And then I read what you write and I'm like, oh, that's a concept that I knew, but didn't really understand. Kind of like management and leadership, like we talked about today. So I appreciate you being here. You are a doll. Thank you so much. This was wonderful.
Oh, thank you so much. I had a blast.